Right. Today, we are going to take a close look at the economic thought of the Enlightenment and how, instead of a moral economy, we are gradually moving towards, during the Enlightenment, towards a political economy. What were the major areas in which the economic thought of the period branched out? Who were the major theorists? And how did literature look at the economic thought of the period? These are some of the debates that I will raise today. And I will begin by referring to one of the authors whom you are rather familiar with, and that is Daniel Defoe. Now, you will remember that Defoe, apart from being a writer, was keenly interested in projects, especially economic projects. He failed spectacularly with a number of them, became bankrupt, and was put in the stocks. But even when he was put in the stocks, he actually sold his pamphlets and used what was a punishment into a kind of an economic opportunity. Now, Defoe was talking about this interesting phenomenon of manufacturing a simple pin. Talks about the division of labor and the way in which a simple pin brings together the effort of so many people and generates so much employment. What, therefore, Defoe was talking about was the primacy of trade. Now, you have done your Renaissance studies, and you will have noted the way in which trading guilds were being formed during the Renaissance. One of the literary aspects of this was The Shoemaker's Holiday by Defoe. And you have the celebration of the trading guild in Defoe. But gradually, you see, trade is becoming a subject that enters literary discourse as well as becomes the center of economic discourse throughout England in the early half of the 18th century, late 17th, early half of the 18th century. In fact, Defoe uses a very interesting phrase. He says, "Trade was the whore I doted upon." Now, this very interesting comparison with trade with his favorite woman, as it were, brings to the forefront the close association of the pursuit of wealth and individual happiness. I think this is a very interesting thought that you should mull over. Traditionally, in the Christian sense, avarice, pride, and guilt were seen essentially as immorality, right? Therefore, the pursuit of wealth in itself was not seen as a science, it was seen as an aberration. And it is therefore that we had a kind of a moral economy, where the pursuit of, where avarice and lucre is seen somewhere as something to be not to be ashamed of, really. You will remember the satirical plays of Johnson, especially those of you who have done, and this class has, Volpone. And you see how, avarice, wealth is seen as an agent that corrupts every single institution of society. In the personalities of Voltaire, Corbaccio, or Corvino, in Volpone, as it were. And, it is like Volpone and Mosca, this satanic duo who rule over this spirit of avarice. But from Defoe onwards, and you see, once again, you'll remember that 1603 is the date when the first ship actually sails for Ceylon, the East India Company. And there's a rapid and rampant profusion of wealth enormous amount of profit that is being brought into London, enormous amount of commodification that happens, and a gradual alteration of the very economic system. Therefore, Defoe says, and it's interesting how this pursuit of wealth is given a certain, not only scientific temper, but also a certain new moral justification. What is this? And I'll quote Defoe. Defoe says, "Nothing obeys the course of nature more exactly than trade. Causes and consequences follow as directly as day and night." So, see, very interestingly, Defoe is amalgamating the discourse of trade with the discourse of human nature, right? And he says the harmony of the creation, the beauty and concern of providence in preparing the world for trade. So, new moral justification, political moral justification, and a sense of the harmony of the world generated through trade is something that Defoe is trying to provide. Now, it's also interesting in the way that Defoe also talks about the increase of foreign commerce and suggests that trade would not just make Britain rich, it would do God's work, civilizing the nations where we and other Europeans are already settled, bringing the naked savages to clothe and instructing barbarous nations how to live. Therefore, Defoe does not see trade as merely an economic activity. It is also a civilizational discourse. And you can see how in Defoe, the roots of early colonization and the discourses of colonization are deeply grafted in. Now, interestingly, this line of argument is championed by author after author. Mandeville, for example, writes about trade as the principal requisite to aggrandize a nation. The Spectator, of course, another major text which provides a justification for trade and places the merchant, Sir Andrew Freeport, right in the Spectator Club, along with Sir Roger de Coverley. So you have a new formation in society where the merchant and the nobility actually share similar kinds of space. So the primacy of the tradesman, the primacy of the merchant becomes critical. Fielding talks about commerce as indeed given a new face to the whole nation and hath almost totally changed the manners, customs, and habits of the people. So social transformation due to trade. And Addison writes that trade has knit mankind together in a mutual intercourse of good offices, distributes and gifts of nature, find work for the poor, add wealth to the rich, and magnificence for the great. So it's as it were, the entire society is being sublimated and economic depravity is being gradually dispelled. So the generation of wealth is not seen as an individual activity. It is rather seen as socially productive, morally acceptable, and something that is genuinely transforming English society. So it is here that you can see trade gaining a new currency, as it were, within the discourse of Enlightenment England. Right. Now, the most important discourse that comes through here, of course, is the opposition, of course, is to the older Christian discourse where lucre is seen as something which is reprehensible. But this is gradually, moving out, wages increase, and there is a gradual acceptance of the fact that trade creates prosperity in general rather than only for certain kinds of people. This is one part of the story, the first part of the story. So from the Christian moral economy, we are moving towards the larger political economy. Right. This is story number one. Story number two is, or the second part of the story is, how does one therefore theorize the principles of trade? Do we get a new theorization? Do we get a new outlook towards trade and commerce? And here, I would like to remind you of the story of politics as well. Just in the way that politics has become a science in the Enlightenment, so also does the science of economics. And here we see a genuine paradigm shift. What was the paradigm earlier? The earlier paradigm was that of mercantilism. It believed in increasing exports and minimizing imports. Right? So a nation prospered as per the mercantilist thought when it could export more and import very little. Therefore, import duties were extremely high, as a result of which fewer foreign goods, lesser luxury, and therefore standards of living or the variety of goods available were, you could say, limited. Now, during the Enlightenment, a number of theorists argue about foreign trade. Now, part of it is, of course, linked with the discourse of colonialism. And the impetus given to foreign trade is, of course, driven by the fact that, you need the raw materials from the colonies and to export goods there. But by and large, now the thesis is that mercantilism does not lead to transformation in terms of wealth. It is rather free trade across nations. Therefore, massive import and export, and therefore generation of wealth of nations rather than the discourse of a wealth of one particular nation becomes critical, right? Therefore, commerce across nations increases phenomenally. Just look at the changes that take place. French wine flows into England. You have the import of cheese. You have the import of Belgium glass, watches. So the English market, as it were, is flushed with goods. And similarly, networks of trade are created. For example, tea and porcelain come in from China. Sugar comes in via Mauritius. You are importing cotton from India, exporting garments, silk outwards to various nations. You are importing coffee from Brazil, and you have the trafficking of men in the form of slaves also from across the world. So if you create a map of trade, as it were, you will find that ships which sail from China to Europe on the way drop and sort of take cargo, both human and also in terms of commodities, and create a network of free trade whereby governmental intervention becomes minimum. Now, see, there are also the East India companies which act as pirates almost, where the license to free trade becomes the modus operandi of great exploitation. But this is justified by the economic theorists. Let us see who they are. Thomas Mann, for example, one of the directors of the East India Company, writes England's treasure by foreign trade. This is 1664. Thomas Munn is M-U-N, by the way. Thomas Munn, M-U-N. Munn measures national economic well-being principally in terms of a favorable balance of trade, right? So a balance of trade becomes the important factor. Hume takes a contrary view. He writes, and this is David Hume, the philosopher, whom we all know about his sentiment, sensibility, but Hume has an equally interesting take. He writes an essay in 1787 titled Of the Balance of Trade, and he addresses it to those who have a strong jealousy with regard to the balance of trade and a fear that all their gold and silver may be living dead. So he's sort of criticizing those who only argue for mercantilism and a favorable balance of trade. And his argument is that a nation need not be apprehensive of losing its money if it preserves its people and its industry, because there exists an automatic economic mechanism which must forever in all neighboring countries preserve money nearly all proportionable to the art and industry of each nation. So there's this network of nations, each of whom will contribute and exchange something with the other, so that you need not bother about balance of trade. It will all even out in the wealth of nations, right? And therefore comes the major treatise on Enlightenment economic thought, and this is an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. This is Adam Smith, 1776. And Adam Smith calls it the modern system. Notice that phrase, modern system. We have a systematic now, therefore, approach to the concept of free trade across boundaries in the wealth of nations. Now, Smith puts forward the thesis that commercial trade across nations has transformed Europe into, I quote, the manufacturers for the numerous and thriving cultivators of America, for almost all the different nations of Asia, Africa, and America, right? So you see, one of the principal reasons that England becomes the center for the Enlightenment is not only in terms of philosophy or political ideas, but it is because in the way in which it has sort of developed and distributed its trade, right? So trade becomes the index of a nation's power. And he suggests that the true source of wealth cannot be very difficult to determine who have been the contrivers of the whole mercantile system, not the consumers, whose interest has been neglected. In place of regulation, labor and consumption is to be the heart of new thinking, right? So instead of conserving money, you have labor and consumption, and the movement towards rampant commodification and luxury that you see in the Rape of the Lock, right? And therefore, you have this term that comes through once you have Adam Smith, the concept of a political economy, laying claim to a superior rationale, a scientific grasp of wealth creation, and the satisfaction of wants. This is marked by a purported analysis of actualities rather than aspirations. And therefore, the debates include the deregulation of grain markets and the question of enclosures. The total privatization of property is replacing the other concepts. Now, let me just briefly talk about this enclosure and how you have seen this in literature, but you never have really understood how this operated. Now, in a village, for example, you would have certain lands which belonged to the landlord, as it were. But there were certain lands which were left for people at large, where the cattle grazed, where you could hold a kind of a fair, which technically would have belonged to the landlord, but it was given over to the village, and therefore it was common land. Now, during the 18th century, when land became a very, very viable and valuable commodity, what happens is that these lands are gradually enclosed. They're given boundaries so that they are no longer accessible, and you are moving more and more towards private property. Think about your Robinson Crusoe, the text that all of you have read, and the way in which the first thing that Robinson Crusoe does is sets up a fence for his island, as it were. Now, Crusoe is there on the island. He doesn't really need a fence, does he? But he marks his territory as private space. You see, think of Robinson Crusoe in many ways as an articulation of what actually Adam Smith and Defoe and the others are talking about. Defoe, of course, is writing Robinson Crusoe. Now, this very idea of this enclosed private space and the land, therefore, through hard labor, multiplying its produce. You remember that moment when green shoots come out and Crusoe is, as it were, sees this as a kind of a magical transformation. And the way in which he gradually builds a granary, creates a kind of surplus, right? And then, sort of brings Friday in as the colonized slave, as it were, and multiplies his wealth several times over. Of course, you need to understand that Crusoe's island economy is self-fulfilling. He does not have the capacity to trade, as it were. But this is an island which is enclosing itself and preparing to trade, as it were. So this question about enclosure and the deregulation of grain markets, many ways, think about the Farm Bill and the debates that are gradually sort of getting, dramatized now. You actually have the same forces coming together. You see the free market demanding its encroachment upon the controlled economy, as it were. The minimum selling price is, of course, a controlled price set forward by the government. And the deregulation of these grain markets is a free market drive, right? So certain debates really don't go away and are raised in many ways. The modern economic thought of capitalization, the capitalism leading to globalization, and this is globalization in a certain way, is a thought that the Enlightenment hands over as a legacy, right? Now, this new political economy was priding itself upon being grounded on a proper grasp of ends and means, right? So you produce what you consume, not what you would not consume. So it's a market that is geared towards consumption. You import what you cannot produce. You export where there is a gap. These are theses, economic theses, that are coming up, right? So these create this almost a sense of Newtonian physics within the science of economics. And here is somebody called Josiah Tucker, who writes that the circulation of commerce may be conceived to proceed from the impulse of two distinct principles of actions in society analogous to the centrifugal and centripetal powers in the planetary system. Fundamentally, centrifugal is demand, centripetal is export, or export and import you see how it is seen in terms of almost Newtonian forces. And Smith, interestingly, uses another metaphor, very interesting metaphor used by Adam Smith. He says that prices were continually gravitating towards the natural price, right? So prices were gravitating towards the natural price. Earlier, because of mercantilism, you did not have imports. Therefore, the price of a commodity would be naturally inflated. Now, when you have free movement of goods, the price is coming down towards, gravitating towards a natural price, right? So by the 1690s, Charles Davenant was already arguing that the market price of corn would prevail despite regulations. And therefore, he writes, the trade in its nature free finds its own channel and best directeth its own course. So the idea that trade cannot be controlled any longer, and that the market is an agent which is free and completely robustly independent, is a thesis that is gaining a lot of currency during this particular period. Also important is the thesis of Locke in this context, which we discussed earlier. Locke is sanctifying private property, right? He's saying that private property is the basis of society and all governments must protect it. So now you have a thesis that selfhood and property and wealth is something that is paramount and the government must defend it, right? Therefore, labor is fundamentally important. Labor creates value, and therefore value is the index of property. Now, I'm not using this in the Marxist sense of labor, but very importantly, the legal guarantee of property is giving a new sanctification to wealth and the pursuit of wealth, as it were. Therefore, the Christian commandments about charity, the Christian commandments about, how avarice is a natural sin, how lucre is to be punished, and how the man of wealth is antithetical to the man of God, is now disappearing to create the generation of a society that is accepting wealth and the merchant as a hero, right? Now, therefore, Adam Smith suggests that it is the desirement of bettering our condition that is the characteristic of every man, and lives by exchanging, and the society itself grows to be what is properly a commercial society. So instead of a moral society, we are now motivated by a desire to improve one's condition, which is sanctified by the economist, and therefore he is arguing that it is a natural desire, and it is through this desire, through the zeal of private effort, labor, and property, that there can be an overall growth in society. And therefore, Smith's formula is that let the marketplace decide, and that selfishness is what makes the world go around. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, of the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. See how from the medieval to the Enlightenment, economics has come a full circle, as it were. It's no longer charity which is the basis of society. Self-interest, even selfishness, is to be seen as something essentially heroic, and therefore something that is essentially transforming not only individual lives, but societies at large. The other thing that I would like to also talk about is how, therefore, this age talks about economic restlessness. Now, this desire to travel, which you see as an integral part of the Enlightenment literature, travel narratives, this impetus to look at new lands, map new territories, sees how restlessness no longer becomes a bane but a virtue, and that this productive restlessness of conquest and control is therefore seen as something transformative, right? And therefore, this is another new direction in which economic thought propels the literature of the period. You see how empirical record of traveling, of mapping, of ethnography, there are certain disciplines which start to, as it were, flower, right? Why are they important? Cartography, ethnography, travel writing, all these become critical in the service of the economic transformation. As the wealth of nations increase, as trade and commerce moves outward, therefore these disciplines to start to move. Now, interestingly, it is also quite fascinating to see how how innovation and trade interact with each other, and how science becomes grafted into this discourse of money making. So science is seen as something that creates innovation and therefore creates a lot of scope for wealth and patenting. Now, look at, say, for example, ship making. Look at the way in which lights are used. Look at the way in which the science of medicine progresses, right? So all these provide a new fillip. Science provides a new fillip to innovation, and innovation provides a new fillip to trade. A simple case would, of course, be the entire cotton industry, as it were, the spinning yarns, and later on the greater spinning machines and so on. You have the rampant windmills as a source of energy, the harnessing of water as a source of energy, the discovery of the pump and the use of the pump as an initial machine in the 18th century. All these innovations in science are now sort of used for the service of trade, as it were. Of course, there is a literature of skepticism as well, especially which talks about paper money, stocks, trade. Remember that the stock exchange is established at the fag end of the 17th century. The 17th century. And the 18th century sees the booming of the stock exchange, and what you will study with Tonukadi, the great crash, which we will talk about in the Beggar's Opera, and in the way in which swindling, money making, the underworld becomes involved in this entire discourse of let us say illicit trade, smuggling, swindling, stocks being scammed, and so on and so forth. Therefore, this is what was the South Sea bubble. Remember, the South Sea bubble, 1725, was one of the greatest scams of the 18th century, where it was circulated that the South Sea Company had brought trading rights for American gold, South American gold. They had actually had the permission to bring one ship laden with bullion, but it was proclaimed that they had the entire right to South American gold. And therefore what happened was that the stock prices of the South Sea Company skyrocketed, right? Almost like the Harshad Mehta scam, as it were, right? So, and people were buying like mad, right? And then, of course, the news came out and the company disintegrated. And you had people running around in the streets, tearing their heads because they had all invested in the South Sea bubble. Let me give you an example, an interesting example. A scientist named Sir Isaac Newton lost 20,000 pounds in that South Sea bubble debacle. And therefore, what is interesting is how the South Sea bubble became a kind of a landmark in the scanning history of the globe. But my point here is, you see, that trading and commerce is not merely restricted now to goods and commodities. It is taking a life of its own in terms of paper money, in terms of bonds, shares in companies. So what we have now as the modern market economy is also something which the Enlightenment is bringing into the economic system, right? And therefore, my point remains, therefore, that with this rampant economic growth, great trade among nations, you also have an infiltration of luxury, right? An infiltration of luxury in the sense that, enormous amounts of commodities enter the literature of the period. And there's no greater example really of this than the Rape of the Lock, where Belinda's dressing table actually becomes a kind of an index of 18th century London and its luxurious lifestyle, where you have the gems from India, the perfumes from Arabia, the combs and made of tusks from Africa, the coffee from Brazil, the tea from China. So you have the globe, as it were, assembling on Belinda's dressing table. So my point, therefore, is that, the spirit of opening up of freedom is not restricted merely to political thought or philosophical thought. It enters and permeates almost every branch of learning and practice. And therefore, this entire opening up of trade and commerce from a mercantile economy to free trade, towards the science of generating wealth, toward newer forms of generating wealth through paper money, and in general, the sanctification of trade commerce as moral as well as transformative of the nation and also of civilization is something that we witness as a fundamental change in the economic thought of the period. Therefore, capitalistic consumer society is legitimized in terms of nature, that capitalism and consumerism elevates and perfects nature, desire, and individual freedom. So individual freedom is closely integrated with the freedom of property and the free economy. And therefore, the pursuit of wealth provides to Enlightenment political thought an extremely radical and fundamental overhaul. I would venture to say, along with philosophy, the Enlightenment's most radical transformation lies in the way in which it approaches it approaches economic thought. Right. It is with that, therefore, that I'd like to bring my part of this discussion to a close. Now I open this up for your questions. Would you like to respond, to make any intervention, or put forward any questions? No? Are you sure? Okay, then I will bring this recording to a close here.